So hi, welcome to our webinar about making webinars. We are from the National Deaf Children's Society providing this presentation on behalf of the Education and Training Foundation. My name is Martin McLean and I lead on post-14 policy and practice, particularly on education and employment for deaf young people. I'll pass over to Natalie now to introduce herself.
Hello everyone, my name's Natalie. I'm a training officer for deaf awareness and BSL at the National Deaf Children's Society. I also deliver training externally. So I offer bespoke training and sign language courses.
Thanks, Natalie. So a bit about the National Deaf Children's Society. We are the UK's leading charity for deaf children and young people. We're a children's charity, but we work with deaf young people up to the age of 25. Our vision is of a world without barriers for deaf young people. And in the past year, we've all seen a huge amount of change. It's had a big impact on how we work and, of course, how we learn. For deaf learners, the pandemic has brought up new issues, particularly in accessing online classes and lectures, which we'll cover today. We are on a roadmap out of lockdown, so a lot more face-to-face teaching will return. However, we anticipate that blended learning will be here to stay. There are some advantages to having webinars and online presentations within the learning mix, and of course, for professional development opportunities. Therefore, we hope that this presentation can be a useful resource for the foreseeable future and not just for life in the pandemic. In this session, we will start by identifying the barriers deaf learners can face in accessing webinars. We'll then go through and introduce 3 case studies for deaf learners, and for each one, identify how we can make online learning more accessible. This will include looking at the accessibility features for most used platforms, in particular Zoom and also MS Teams. We'll finish off by signposting to resources for further information. There will be time for you to ask any questions you have. Okay, so our first topic is the trouble with webinars. And we're going to give you a short task. So this is about identifying barriers. So what I'm going to do now is show a fake Zoom webinar and ask you to make a note to yourself of how many things you could spot that could actually make the webinar difficult to access if you are deaf. You can either make a private note to yourself, or you can type any sort of barriers you've identified into the comment box for everyone to see. So I'm going to come out of the presentation now to play the video, as if I try playing it within PowerPoint, it tends to get a bit jerky and slow. Hello everyone, welcome to my chocolate bad webinar. Okay, I hope you're sitting comfortably with a cup of coffee as I introduce what is our hot topic. So just bear with me while I share my screen to introduce this topic. And yes, indeed, the topic is, what is the best biscuit to go with your cup of coffee? It's a difficult question, but of course, but you need to look at the properties of that perfect biscuit. Wow, think about the flavor. How did it, obviously, what does it taste like? Many flavors and fillings are susceptible to heat. And when you're baking a biscuit, the protection of those flavors need to be considered. So that's number one. Another thing is texture. Is it is it flaky? What is the texture? How did it feel in the mouth? Is it crispy, smooth, crunchy? And of course, bone also really important in this as well. Well, let's move on now. Talk about the main ingredient of most biscuits, and that is flour. Flour, the crucial ingredient, which will be composed of carbohydrate, protein, and fat. There's some fiber, and the protein itself is gluten. In terms of that presentation, I'm sorry, but I turned such a delightful subject, such as biscuits, into something that turned out to be quite dull. So quite a few of you have identified a number of issues with that presentation and why that would be difficult for a deaf learner to access. We got some kind of pre-prepared barriers that we identified on our side. Firstly, you had poor sound quality. There's definitely some mottling that was going on that was interfering with my voice, but may have well been issues with the quality of the playback, that was interrupting the sound. For deaf learners who use hearing aids or cochlear implant, then having poor sound quality can actually be quite disruptive. Hearing aids and cochlear implants are also pretty bad for picking up background noise and be quite difficult to distinguish between what you want to hear and other noises. My face was often not visible for lip reading. Sometimes I had a cup in front of my lips. Sometimes my hands were in the way. So that was not good practice. Also, the screen was dark, giving a worse picture quality. There were no subtitles. There was no BSL interpretation, which some of you identified. Sometimes there was too much text on the screen, and what I was saying was not really corresponding with the text. So having too much to read, and then if you also have to focus on either lip reading or if you did have subtitles or trying to read that, then that's going to be challenging to have to read a lot of text plus captions. If I spoke too fast, then that was going to be a problem in terms of trying to process what was being said. And finally, there was no real pause there to allow reading time for slides. So if you're showing a slide and someone's got to try and focus on lip reading you or reading subtitles or looking at a sign language interpreter, they haven't got enough time to do that, plus absorb what's on the slide. So having a pause there would allow more time for reading. Okay, unfortunately, our surveys of young people and families have found that the majority of deaf children and young people are finding remote learning quite difficult to access at the moment compared with face-to-face learning. For the reasons outlined on the slide, the result of which we fear could have a long-term impact on attainment and progression for some. There is a failure of providers to make reasonable adjustments, which is very serious as it is potentially against the law as set out within the Equality Act 2010. I'm now going to pass over to Natalie to start talking about some of the solutions and how they can vary between different deaf young people.
Okay. So next slide, please, Martin. Okay, as I explained before, my role is to teach deaf awareness. And when I am presenting my deaf awareness programme, I use that word deaf and deafness. And we always like to think about what that word actually means. It could be a deaf person. It could also incorporate a deafened person, a hard of hearing person, a deaf-blind person. So deafness can be anything from being profoundly deaf to having a moderate or just mild hearing loss. It could be people who were born deaf. It could be someone who has lost their hearing very, very quickly, possibly through injury or illness. And of course, there are lots of people who lose their hearing over time as they get older. Deaf-blind people might be that they have some level of hearing loss and then they also lose their sight as well. So the communication needs of those people are all totally different. It could be that they use their voice and they speak. It could be that they lip read. They could use SSE. SSE stands for Sign Supported English. And that is basically following English grammar and signing at the same time. So signing the words along with the English. BSL, on the other hand, which is British Sign Language, has its own grammar, its own structure. We incorporate facial expressions for intonation, things like that, like I'm using today. So people often ask what the difference is between BSL and SSE. And it's one of those things, if you're trying to speak at the same time as using BSL, it's really difficult. The words would all be in the wrong order. So you kind of either need to do one or the other. You either need to do SSE, which signs as you're speaking, or you need to do full BSL with its own grammar. So there's also hands-on sign language, which means that someone is actually holding on to the person as they're signing, and then they release to then be able to sign back to them. And it could be that people use hearing aids and cochlear implants. Do all people sign? No, it's totally dependent. It could be that a person uses hearing aids and can then speak quite easily. It could be that they wear hearing aids and use sign language. For example, for me today, I could potentially talk and someone would be able to sign things back to me, or I can watch the palantypist, or the person can sign back to me. So, I mean, we always try and explain that when we are talking about deafness, we are incorporating all these different methods of communication and all these different types of deafness. And the important thing is always to ask someone what their preference is. And deaf people are usually very happy to be asked that question. They like to be able to say what their preferences are. So you can always ask and they will be very happy to tell you. Next slide, please. So we have another case study. We have Samira this time. And this is a fake person. Samira is not real, but it has happened many, many, many times in real life. So I'm going to give you something to look at. I'd like you to quickly have a read through of that and maybe make some notes just for roughly a minute and see what you make of that. I'll maybe give you 1 or 2 minutes just to think about that once you've had a read through it. Okay, great. I hope you've thought of a few things, made some notes maybe. Thank you for those things that have come up in the chat box. It's very difficult for me to read the chat and look at the interpreter at the same time. So forgive me if I miss anything that's gone on there. So Samira is profoundly deaf. So we are thinking about sharing a screen. If there are maybe 2 to 4 people on the screen, it's quite easy. You can adjust the screen so that you can see people on the right-hand side and have the shared screen on the left-hand side. But imagine if there are 10 people, 20 people all on the Zoom call, and you get all these tiny little thumbnails of all these people's faces, and then it's really, really hard to see people. So that's why we always encourage people to turn their cameras off if possible, so that it's just the people that you need on the screen. So for us today, we have the interpreter and the presenter. So it makes it more comfortable for the deaf person to be able to see just those 2 people on the screen rather than a whole screen full. We also need to think about giving Samira enough time to look at the slide, read through the slide and see the interpreter at the same time. So imagine if you were being asked to look through that, but not given enough time to read it when the interpreter is actually signing away. So that's really difficult. You need to always give someone maybe a little bit extra time just to pause things and read through. And it's really great if the tutor or teacher can just say, is everyone finished? Have they all read it? Are we ready to move on before they're moving on? Also, instead of using lots and lots of written text, it's a really good idea to have some bullet points on there because it makes it much easier to digest and much easier to look from quicker, to look between the interpreter and the screen. It's also worth thinking about how Samira might be able to contribute. If we've all got our microphones turned off and if you can't see people and the interpreter's flying away at super speed, it's very difficult to go through and make your contributions. So it might be that we can say, right, Natalie, we need to say something. And if people are having a conversation, it's sometimes very difficult to work out who is speaking at one time. So it's always worth saying, right, I am Natalie here, I am just saying this. So it's just worth coming in and explaining. And you can see at the moment that I'm waiting for the interpreter to finish, because there is sometimes a time lag when you've got an interpreter on screen. So we look to each other to make sure that the communications all happen smoothly, and then we're not getting too far behind. So there will always be those little pauses. So tutors need to be aware that if someone wants to say something, it might be that they say, right, Natalie first, yes, then Rosie, then Ali, so that the deaf person knows who is going to be talking and they can focus in on those people if needs be. And the same if Samira wants to contribute herself, and she will need to turn her camera on to sign to the interpreter. Now, like I said before, if you've all got your cameras off, it might be that you have to think of an alternative. You might have to say, can we quickly just turn on Samira's camera and she can pop up and sign her question, and the interpreter can voice over for her. And the same, if someone else wants to ask a question, you turn your camera on, you can ask a question and then turn it back off again. Also, if you're going to incorporate any kind of games or quizzes or anything like that into your tutorials or your webinars, you need to think about how they can be accessible. Often there are quick answer polls and things like that. And by the time the deaf person has watched the interpreter interpret that, all the answers have already gone up, the chat box is all full of text, and the deaf person is missed out just because of that time lag. So that's another really important thing to consider. If a deaf person is looking at an interpreter and they think that they might know what the answer is, and you put something in the chat box and everyone is using the chat box, the actual answer can sometimes just get totally lost because there's so many other things in the chat box. The actual important information can sometimes just get lost and you can't necessarily scroll up and find it again. So it's easy to miss out things in chat boxes. So obviously there are loads and loads of considerations. If you are looking at a screen for a large amount of time, it's also very tiring. It's tiring for you guys, I'm sure. And it's even worse for a deaf person because they are having to stare at that interpreter so that they don't miss anything. They can't just kind of turn off and just listen. So having some short breaks is incredibly worthwhile, just to have a little break for your eyes and go away from the screen for a moment and come back refreshed. Breakout rooms is another thing that's worth mentioning. It's quite complicated. If you're sending deaf people off to a breakout room, you often find that the interpreter hasn't been moved to the same breakout room. And obviously they're in there without any way to communicate. So you have to always make sure that the deaf person is moved into the same breakout room as their interpreter. Okay, so I hope that's useful going through that with Samira. I think we've already covered those ones. Okay. When you're making webinars accessible, it's always good to encourage students to pin interpreters if they're using them. On Zoom webinars, it's sometimes quite difficult. You're having issues with pinning and spotlight. That is the issue that we encountered today. It wasn't letting us spotlight people. So we need to make sure that the deaf person has the right settings and the right permissions on the Zoom webinar to be able to pin or spotlight people that they need to see on screen. Okay, thank you. I think we're done with Samira.
Now back to me, and I'm going to look at case study B, that of Fred. So Dr. Smith has been invited to give an online lecture on an unusual topic, meat lovers and veganism. Dr. Smith will be showing a 15-minute video as part of this presentation. Fred is severely deaf, uses hearing aids and does not sign. He relies on lip reading and sound together to understand people. How can this online lecture be made accessible for Fred? So let's give you a moment to consider that. Okay, so Fred relies on lip reading, as we've already identified. This can be challenging on a screen, particularly with small windows and blurry pictures. Circling can help a bit if your face is as visible as possible, but even if it's fully clear on the screen, it can still be harder to lip read off the screen compared to having a person physically in front of you in full 3D. Also, it would make it hard for you to show slides because once you start showing your screen, the size of your window will shrink. However, there are solutions, particularly if English is good enough to benefit from captions. During the pandemic, many deaf people have been making greater use of auto captions. This is where voice recognition software is used to create subtitles. They're available on several platforms: Teams, Zoom, Skype, and Google. If you're delivering a webinar, then you need to make sure this function is switched on and enabled. I have been into Teams meetings, for example, and even though the functionality is there, the meeting organizer has sometimes not enabled it within the settings to allow me to access the auto captions. Now, anyone who has tried auto captions will know that they are not perfect, far from it. There will be errors, some of which will be quite interesting. You should have these captions switched on yourself. If you are relying on captions to provide access to your student, it's your responsibility to make sure that they are coming out clearly. Don't rely on the student to have to intervene every time something is not clear. Sometimes for some students or for some situations, it simply would not be appropriate to rely on auto captions. You'll need to look at bringing in support. So today we have a speech-to-text reporter, otherwise known as the palantypist, providing our captions within Zoom. These are people trained to provide a live stream and an accurate and verbatim account of what is being said. they have access to phonetic keyboard and inputting sounds which get converted into words through the software they use. The text can be inputted directly into Zoom, which is what we see today. It can come out a bit slow, which is why we also make a HTML link available to where you can see the text coming out word by word rather than just line by line. An electronic note taker is a similar role, but requires less training, and the text provided is not a verbatim account, so not every word is captured, but it still provide a comprehensive account of what's being said, and the student can read this afterwards too. A manual note taker is someone who simply take a set of notes. It's not really suitable for following a presentation, but does mean that a deaf student has a set of notes after the session. Now, just because something is well captioned, you should not assume that the student has processed everything. Some deaf learners will find it harder to process written English at speed due to the impact of delayed language development earlier in life. Therefore, it's helpful to go over what was covered in a session with a communication support worker or a qualified teacher for deaf, for example, recapping, checking and understanding, reinforcing what's been covered during the online session. During the recent closure at colleges, this type of support was often taking place online too. Obviously, with these forms of support, there is a cost, and that has to be planned for, budgeted for. I'm going to very quickly come out of PowerPoint to show another video. This video explains how you can switch on captions within Teams. So, we're clicking on the 3 dots at the top of your screen, and then scrolling down to click on live captions. When you speak, captions appear. That's quite straightforward as long as they are enabled within Teams. With Zoom, auto captions have just recently been added to Zoom, but with Pro accounts only. For free accounts, they're expected to be available by the autumn. For now, individuals can fill in a form to apply to Zoom to have access to the auto captions. This video, which is provided by Zoom on YouTube, explains how you can have captions being typed by palantypists and also the auto captions. I'm going to try and play this and hope it is.
Zoom provides accessibility tools, including closed caption. To enable closed caption, please visit zoom.us and log in to view the meeting settings page. Edit Advanced Meeting Settings and make sure that closed caption is checked and save the change. Next time you start a meeting or webinar, you will see the closed caption button at the bottom of the Zoom panel. This feature is seen only by the meeting host. Click here to start using closed caption. Choose to type the captions yourself or open the participant list to assign. Float your mouse over the correct name, click the More menu, and click Assign to Type Closed Caption. Once control is assigned, that participant can click their CC button to see the entry field. This window can be moved around on the screen. Simply type in the bottom of the field and press Enter to submit. Save the closed caption history as a text document. Other meeting participants can view the closed caption text by clicking the CC icon on their Zoom panel. The captions will show at the bottom middle of the screen, whether you are sharing screen content or webcams. Click to expand and scroll through or save the text history. Locate the Zoom software settings and view the Accessibility tab to adjust the size of the closed caption font that you will see on your computer. You will also find a list of keyboard shortcuts here. To learn more, visit zoom.us/live training to register for weekly training sessions. Need help? Please visit support.zoom.us for 24/7 assistance.
Okay, for pre-recorded presentations, so sometimes you are not delivering a live presentation, but creating a video recording of your lecture. Now, if that is the case, it will be your responsibility to ensure that the recording is accessible. How you do that might depend on the platform you are using. A lot of higher education and FE providers are using lecture capture platforms, and some have automatic transcribing functionality and the ability to edit any subtitles created. If you're not using any particular lecture capture platform, or the platform your provider uses does not allow for captioning, then you may well choose to upload your video to a site such as YouTube. YouTube has automatic transcribing software, and this will produce a set of captions which, depending on the clarity of your speech, are usually riddled with quite a few errors and can lack punctuation. You, however, can access the transcription within YouTube and make your own corrections to this. Alternatively, if you already have a script for what you were saying in your video, you can upload this into YouTube, and then YouTube software will match your script to the sound file. Pass back over to Natalie now for case study C.
Okay, so case study C. Next slide, please. Right, here we go. Thank you. So, same as before, if you wouldn't mind reading that brief case study and having a think about how we might be able to adjust things for Elijah. So, same again, if you make a few notes for yourself, just to see what you think for this case study. Okay, so I hope you managed to get something down, think of something. I'm sure you are all well aware of how many people are using Zoom for meetings and for all kinds of different things. People often will wear a headset with microphone, which does sometimes help cut down on any background noise. And I'm sure that you sometimes find that clearer yourselves. It's just also worth thinking about what is going on in your background, whether there is any background noise that may well affect someone who is wearing a hearing aid. Because as we've mentioned, hearing aids can't really discriminate against what is the main voice and what is background noise. So if you've got the window open or a fan on or your dog barking, it can really interfere with the actual voice. So try and mute yourself if you're not talking, or potentially using a headset is sometimes quite useful. Deaf students will usually have their own technology and it's always a good opportunity to try different things. Some have Bluetooth, different radio aids, different software on their laptops potentially. So you just need to be a bit careful if people do have specific equipment that they're using with their hearing aids or cochlear implants. It can sometimes have an effect on what they're using, and it means that the background noise sometimes is amplified into their cochlear implants or their hearing aids, and it can become really confusing. So you need to make sure that you have all the connections properly and that everything is working so that we can all hear clearly. I mean, technology is changing so quickly. It is difficult to keep up with it, and you will have problems, I'm sure, and you'll be unsure about it. You can always go to the National Deaf Children's Society's website, where we have information about different types of technology available. So if you go to ndcs.org.uk, or you can just Google it, we've got loads of information, and deaf students can go and have a look at that as well, see if there's any equipment that might help them for school, college, university, and so on. The other thing, as you can see there, good lighting, as we've already mentioned, really important for everyone. Okay, next slide. So here we've got some very general tips if you're using Zoom or Teams. Things, as I've said, are moving so quickly, and it's really important that you do make sure that you're updating the app that you're using or the website that you're using. The teachers, the support workers, the students themselves, make sure that you're regularly updating the software that you're using. As we mentioned earlier, you have different types of account for Zoom. You've got Zoom Standard, Zoom Pro, so there are different settings on each of those potentially. So you need to make sure that they are all set up right. And if you're setting up any kind of teaching online, it's always good to check things through with the interpreters and palantypists if you're using them in advance. And if it's first time that you're ever doing it, it's really good to book people half an hour early or get into the webinar beforehand, just to make sure that you have got all the technical considerations sorted out. You can explain what activities you're going to do. You can explain what breakout rooms and things like that, just so that the interpreters are well prepared and ready. Palantypist knows what's going on, and you can all deliver a nice, smooth presentation for your students. It's important, as I mentioned earlier, to give people permission to multi-pin as well. Mostly it will just be 2 as a maximum. You can go in and pin, you can see my interpreter now or the speaker, me. If you go over, if you hover over the little icon, you get a blue button on the top right hand corner with three little dots in it, and if you have permission you can then go in and pin someone's video if you're not aware already. So it means that they are fixed on your screen and you won't suddenly lose them. So you can pin everyone in advance if you will join up beforehand so that they're all on screen. If you use gallery view as well, you can see everyone there at the same time, or you can set it up to have speaker view and just have your interpreter on the screen if needs be. So it's worth encouraging deaf people, if they haven't used it before, just telling them about the pin function and having a play around and seeing what works for them. This is an important one as well. When you are using breakout rooms, if you have lots of deaf people, deaf students, and you only have one interpreter, it means that the two deaf people will need to go into the breakout room with the interpreter. If you wanted them to be in separate ones, then you would need to have two interpreters. So that's another thing just to think about. Okay, another important one, I've already mentioned it, having an eye break. It's so tiring. Zoom fatigue, looking at interpreters, looking at speakers, focusing on a screen. It is really, really tiring. So make sure that you factor in those breaks. If you have a 1 hour session, it could be that you are having, say, a 20-minute bit of lecture, then a 5-minute break, and then another 20 minutes, and factor it in like that. And it's also worth just checking that the deaf people are okay. Sometimes it might be that they'll say, yeah, I'm fine, carry on, everything's good. And sometimes they will be desperate for a break. So yeah, always worth to just check. And again, it's really important to encourage turn taking so that the deaf people don't get left out of contributing. So it could be that hearing people can just cut in quite quickly, and the deaf person is waiting there with their hand up trying to interject. So yeah, just consider how you're going to facilitate turn taking between the whole group. And do try and avoid having too many things to do. If you're trying to look at a slide, look at an interpreter, look at a chat box, look at the papers you've been sent in advance, it's really tricky to try and concentrate on everything. Really worth sending deaf students the information beforehand so that they have a chance to read through and dissect it a bit. Or you could focus on the chat box only, and maybe next time have a PowerPoint. You just need to plan well so that everything is covered, really. I mean, it's impossible to cover everything with you in 1 hour. I know it's been a whistle-stop tour. We do have a lot more information, lots more resources, and you can have a look through those in your own time. But as I mentioned, the technology is always developing, so do make sure that you've got an up-to-date app, and hopefully this information won't become too old too quickly. Okay, back to Martin now.
So, well, next, today we can't cover everything. Of course, we focus on access to webinars in this session, but a full deaf awareness course can last a whole day. We, however, have lots and lots of information resources for education professionals at the National Deaf Children's Society, and with SEND more generally, the Education Training Foundation has a lot of resources too. Two resources I specifically want to refer to here. One is guidance on remote learning, which developed last year when the pandemic came along, so particularly relevant to today's webinar. And the second resource, which you see on the right of the screen, is our deaf-friendly teaching in FE guide, which is aimed at mainstream teachers and practitioners, SEND coordinators as well. And it provides information and guidance on meeting the needs of deaf students in further education. It covers teaching, learning, assessment, and also supporting the transition into and out of FE. All of our resources for professionals can be downloaded free of charge. There is a requirement to become a professional member when you've accessed more than 5 pages, but this is a really easy step and it's free to do so. It means you have access to many of our resources and you also are updated when we've got new ones to share. The Education and Training Foundation has an excellence gateway where you can search from over 7,000 resources to support professionals in the FE sector. Within this, there's a section on SEND, which again includes a wealth of resources, including a set of quality standards for deaf learners, which our guidance cross-links to. The Education Training Foundation also has SEND Centres for a SEND Centres for Excellence project, where there are 3 exemplar colleges leading by example, with 3 categories and providing workshops, webinars and activities you can all access. Western College is leading on people, which is all about ensuring staff and learners are supported, particularly with mental, social and emotional needs. Derby College leads on curriculum and how you can ensure it has a clear purpose and enables learners with SEND to achieve their aspirations. And City College Norwich lead on community, making sure that learners with SEND are progressing and being present within their communities. And FE leaders can access one-to-one sessions with the leaders of these 3 colleges. If you are interested, please book through one of the email addresses shown on the screen. To see what's coming up, check out the Centres for Excellence section on the SEND Excellence Gateway. If you use Twitter, you might want to use the hashtag SENDinFE. You might want to tweet about today's webinar if you found it useful. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. You can also see mine and Natalie's email addresses on the screen. If you have any questions, you think of afterwards, you are feel free to email us. That's everything. So thank you all for attending. It's been great to have so many people here, and we'll be in touch with a copy of the presentation afterwards and with those links that I referred to. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you very much.